Hello, and thank you for watching this presentation by the American Iris Society. Please support the organization by becoming a member. Go to irises.org and click on Join. Thank you.
So I want to start this since we're doing this first webinar and it's new for me too. I just wanted to say a couple things at the beginning. And one of the programs that I was going to do when we had our convention in Newark and New York City was a presentation at the New York Botanical Garden where the American Iris Society was founded. And so this is part of that, but although it's been adjusted and I'm doing 2 webinars and it's going to have some more history and things like that in these 2 webinars than I would have had time to do in New York City. But so part of this will be about that program that I was going to present at the New York Botanical Garden. So I'm calling this Irises and AIS, the early years. And this will just take us up to the middle of the 20th century, around 1950 or so. And it's not a strict history type thing. There's so much history in all of these time periods. The hardest thing is to decide what to leave out and what you can put in. And I didn't have a lot of space to put in a lot of things. So you'll see things that you'll wonder, well, why didn't he put that in? Because it's missing. Well, I just didn't have time for or space and the time for an hour program to put it all in. So this is just some of the things that happened. And to get going, before the American Iris Society was founded, there were iris species and cultivars that were grown and studied for hundreds of years before 1920. And species in particular, and then hybrids started coming around. Hybridizers started just choosing irises. Many of the early historic irises were undoubtedly bee pods. But there were hybridizers or plantsmen who were very selective. And so they chose some of those selections to introduce. And Madame Chiraut is one of those from Jean-Nicolas Lemont in 1844. So some of these hybrids have been around now for well over a century and a half or longer. And there were species and varieties that were very close to the species. A very early classic neglecta is Faustine, which is still available. I still have it in my garden from Lemont in 1859. And then moving up to the 20th century, the 21st, to the 20th century, the 1900 and up to 1920, there were lots of irises from Europe and species from all over the world, Asia and the Middle East and Europe. And from France, we had irises such as Demi-Duel from Louis Denis in 1912. I still have this one in my garden too. It's a great little iris. And there were all sorts of irises like this from France. France was a big hotbed of irises, if you will, around this time, and there were lots of people working with irises in those early years. Romeo from Millet and Fille in 1912 was another. I would also like to just point out that some of these photos are mine. Some of them are from the wiki, from the encyclopedia, and some from other people that I've gotten photos from. So they're not all mine. I couldn't have done this without a lot of help from getting photos from other places. From Great Britain, there were a good number of irises as well. The Spuria iris, Shelford Giant, from Sir Michael Foster in 1913. And Sir Michael Foster was a physician and did a lot of research on irises. This is about, I think he died about 1913. So this was one of the last irises that was introduced from Sir Michael Foster. And Dominion from Arthur John Bliss, A.J. Bliss in 1917. A really important hybridizer in Great Britain. And Dominion is one of those irises that breeders really used in later hybridizing. And Bliss, who lived in Devon, England, I think he died around 1931. He was one of the first people, first hybridizers to really keep strict records. So his work and all of those records that he kept was sort of a guide for hybridizers later on. And when he died, the April 1932 issue of the AIS Bulletin was devoted to information about Bliss. That's how important he was and his irises were to American irises and the American Iris Society. And Dominion, in particular, was a descendant of Black Prince. Was an earlier iris, and Dominion was possibly the first tetraploid variety that then launched the iris revolution during the 1920s. So you can't overstate the importance of this iris and A.J. Bliss. Another from Bliss was Tristram in 1919. And this photo is from a lantern slide from Swarthmore College, the Wister collection. There's a whole collection of these lantern slides. And this is one of the really good ones, but some of the impurities or artifacts you can see on the slide there, that's from that lantern slide. And if you look at the old bulletins of the American Iris Society, they will list, you could rent lantern slides and get them from the American Iris Society, much as you can get programs now. And it would tell you the lantern slides are available from so-and-so. So that was kind of a big thing back in the 20s. It was rather amazing. That must have been a real job to ship those. And then another Bliss introduction in 1926, is jumping ahead a little bit, is Grace Sturtevant. And this iris was a descendant of Dominion. And we'll talk a little bit more about Grace Sturtevant, but I put this iris in just because it was in honor of Grace Sturtevant, who was an American irisarian. And we'll have more about her in just a couple minutes. But a nice iris and a descendant of Dominion, so an important iris too. And then there was from Mrs. William Crawford in 1914 from the United States, getting into some of those early irises before 1920. This is a sport of the species Iris florentina, and it's very crinkled, and I think if it was in our being introduced now, it would probably be introduced as a novelty iris. And actually, they called new irises back then in the 20s. They called them novelties just because they were new. And but this one is, even by today's standards, rather novel. Another hybridizer that was really important, and again, you can't really overstate his importance, was Bertram Farr. And he was one of the purveyors of fine irises in the United States before AIS. This particular catalog was a 1915 catalog that Farr put out from his garden and home in Wyomissing, Pennsylvania. And this catalog had 16 pages of devoted entirely to irises. He had all sorts of perennials, had a lot of peonies and lilies and various things like that, but 16 pages of just irises. And these were not, didn't have photos and all that. It was just iris after iris after iris. So there was a whole collection of irises well before 1920. Farr started his nursery business and catalog in 1910, and then I think he died around 1924. So he had this nursery for 14, 15 years. During that time, he introduced 56 bearded iris cultivars and 30 beardless. And he was one of the best known sources of irises in the United States. He would order irises from Europe and from the big hybridizers in France and England and Germany, and then sell them through his catalog. But he also hybridized and introduced these other 86 cultivars of his own. And this happens to be Quaker Lady, which is still a very popular historic iris, and a lot of people have it, from 1909. One of the Japanese irises that he introduced in 1910 was I'm not sure how you say that, Sumidagawa, one of the 26 Japanese irises introduced by Farr. And you notice, you know, these Japanese irises look really good. And that's because Japanese irises have been grown for centuries in Japan, and as potted plants and in gardens and beds. And they had been hybridized for these centuries and passed on to descendants and the next generation. So there was it's really the only species that had just a tremendous amount of hybridizing going on before the 1900s. And then there was this fellow whose name was the Reverend Charles Harrison. And he lived in York, Nebraska. And he owned a nursery. He was a traveling preacher. He would travel to these little towns and preach. And in so doing, he also saw lots of gardens. He grew a lot of plants. He had a great education from horticulturists. He was going back to the East Coast and to Ohio and Iowa and various places, meeting with horticulturists, and he bought irises and then resold them. He was one of the people that the Sass brothers purchased their irises from in Nebraska before 1915. So this is well before the American Iris Society was formed. He also published the first American book on irises in 1909. And the book was simply titled A Manual on the Iris. Honor Whitehead did an entire book on the Reverend C.S. Harrison. And in that book, she determined that a manual on the iris was published in 1909. He doesn't put a date in the book. It was revised in 1916. And Harrison died in 1919, just before the American Iris Society was founded. He also wrote books on peonies and phlox and other titles. And this caption below his photo says, "Let this be your motto, have it ingrained in your soul. Beauty is wealth." And he had a large nursery in York, Nebraska, which was said to have been the finest collection of perennials west of Chicago. So he was an important person. He knew Bertram Farr, I believe, from his writings, and probably ordered from him. So anyway, I put it in here because of, just because, for one thing, he wrote the first American book on irises, that first one that we know of. And then there were others before 1920. Goose and Koneman worked on tall beardeds and dwarfs, and they were in Germany. Their nursery was destroyed in World War I, but they restarted it, and in 1920 they were back up. And Lorelei is one of those irises that they introduced in 1909. It was registered as a TB, but now it's considered to be an IB, intermediate bearded iris. Another person that was important at that time before 1920 was Jeanette Dean on the West Coast. She offered Evansias, Pacific Coast native irises, aerial species, dwarfs, French hybrids, tall beardeds. And she was a really important purveyor of irises on the West Coast. And then there was the war. World War I, just before the American Iris Society was founded. The war went from July 1914 to November 11th of 1918. And John Wister had been thinking about an Iris Society before the war, and once the war was over, he was a soldier in the war, as were Robert Sturtevant and B.Y. Morrison. And when they came back from the war, they started to work to forming the American Iris Society. And this is a picture of John Wister at the New York Botanical Gardens a few years later. And it's another one of those Swarthmore Lantern slides. Swarthmore College, who he happened to, he lived very near Swarthmore College, and he was the landscape architect who designed the grounds of Swarthmore. Swarthmore is said to be the most beautiful college campus in the United States. So he did a great job, apparently. I've been to Swarthmore. It is a very beautiful campus. So this is him at the New York Botanical Garden, though. And John Wister is another of those people that you can't overstate his importance. He was the first president of AIS. He was president for 14 years. He then, in 1922, he was in Europe and Great Britain, and he encouraged his British friends to found the British Iris Society. And they did. They founded it 2 years after the American Iris Society in 1922. And for his help and work and advice, they bestowed on him honorary membership in the British Iris Society, and then awarded him the Foster Memorial Plaque. And the Foster Memorial Plaque is the highest award that the British Iris Society gives to an individual, and it's named for Sir Michael Foster. I'll show you a picture of the plaque a little bit later, but he was one of the first people in the United States to receive the Foster Memorial Plaque. He also received the American Iris Society Gold Medal in 1930. He had been president of AIS for 10 years at that point, 1930, and he was still going to go another 4 years, but at that point, I guess they decided he'd been president all these for a whole decade, so he deserved the gold medal. So they gave it to him then. He has been honored with awards from other societies, the American Peony Society, the International Lilac Society, the American Horticultural Society, the Royal Horticultural Society in Great Britain. They dedicated their daffodil and tulip yearbook to him. He was the first non-European to receive that honor. He won lots of awards from a great many horticultural groups. John Wister is the person that the Wister medals now are given for tall bearded irises, and there are 3 Wisters given each time that the American Irish Society judges vote for awards. And Robert Sturdivant, who was the first secretary of the American Irish Society and was involved in the American Irish Society for quite a long time, wrote, "Probably few current members realize that the AIS started through the efforts and initiative of one man, John C. Wister." So Wister was a really important person in getting the American Irish Society not only started, but managed for the first 14 years.
Gary,
Yes.
there's a question here. What is a lantern slide?
You know, I think it's one of those glass slides that they had those. I don't know exactly how. I should have looked that up a little bit, but it's a glass slide, and they have a sort of a silver backing, and they the photo is then exposed to that silver, and the photo comes out, and it's a rather heavy slide. So it's a glass slide. As far as my knowledge of it is, somebody probably may know have more information about that, but
someone says here, Suzanne says that they are hand painted slides. Hand painted.
Okay, some of them may be, but I think some of them are actual photos. They may be colorized as well.
So then, how about the pandemic?
Yeah, that was a question I had. The 1918 pandemic. What effect did it have on AIS? And I don't really know. Perhaps if we did a lot of reading around that time in every single bulletin and every word, I don't know if they would have mentioned in 1920, but by that time it was over. And I don't know that they really dwelled on it very much. And I have never seen anything that talked about AIS and irises or anything before the 1920 associated with the pandemic. So I don't know. I'm sure it did have some effect, obviously, but what that was is a question. So the history of irises mirrors the history of AIS from 1920 and forward. January 29th, 1920 was when the American Irish Society was founded in New York City at the New York Botanical Garden, and it was chartered in Pennsylvania February 3rd, 1927. So 1920, another year like 2020, it was a year to be reckoned with. 1920 was a leap year, as is this year, and it was a landmark year on several fronts. Besides the formation of the American Irish Society, Prohibition began in January of 1920 as well, with the 18th Amendment in effect, and that was to last until 1933. Women fought for and won the right to vote through the 19th Amendment in August of 1920. And one really rather strange thing is the US Postal Service ruled in June of 1920 that children could not be sent by parcel post. So that sounds rather funny, but I guess if you were the child being sent that way, it wouldn't be so funny. I don't know. So 1920, it was a momentous year, 100 years ago this year. And it was at the New York Botanical Garden where the founding meeting occurred. And there's a great write-up by Honor Whitehead that you can read about that meeting. And the weather was horrid. It was January 29th. But a lot of people showed up, a lot more people than what you would think would have come to the New York Botanic Garden in New York City to be at this meeting to found the American Irish Society. And two of the botanists who were there and managing the New York Botanic Garden at the time were Dr. Nathaniel Lord Britton and Dr. Henry Gleason. And Britton was a founder of the New York Botanic Garden. a couple decades earlier. His wife actually, on a trip to England, they went to Kew and came back, and she was the one who said, you know, it'd be great if we had something like that here in the United States to that we could go to and have all of these plants and people, and so he started working on it and put together this huge group of benefactors, and it reads like a who's who of the benefactors of the day, DuPonts, and lots of these rich people put their money into the New York Botanic Garden, and Britton became the first director of the garden, and so he was the director when AIS was formed in 1920. He was a preeminent botanist, and I knew about Britton before I ever knew about AIS. I was in school studying botany, and there's a huge 3-volume publication called Britton and Brown's Illustrated Flora of Northern US, Canada, and the British Possessions. It was revised a couple times after that. They took out the words of British possessions, and they called it Northeastern US and Canada and that sort of thing in the revisions. But it huge, very, very large 3-volume books. That was the flora of the Northeastern United States, and we just called it Britton and Brown. And so Britton was the primary author of this huge work. And Brown was a judge, Judge Addison Brown, and he was the sort of managed the publication of the book and all of that, the books. And so that was part of the contribution to American botany. A huge contribution to American botany was Dr. Britton. And then Dr. Gleason, Henry Gleason, was another famous botanist, and he acted as the secretary for this big meeting that occurred in the New York Botanic Garden where the AIS was founded. And they sent out all of these invitations to people around the country and the world. There were some people from Europe there, I think, too, but he was the one who received the replies back, and he did a great deal of work for this. Both of these two people were charter members of the American Iris Society, and Dr. Gleason even then became a director, continued as an AIS director for several years, and he was the first curator of museums. And the other person that really did a lot of botanical work that was there at the same time, although he was not, as far as I can tell, was not a charter member of AIS, was John Kunkle Small. And Small wrote the Flora of the Southeastern United States. And he was a botanist at the New York Botanic Garden at the same time. And one of the irises that he discovered and named and described was Iris giganticerulea in around the New Orleans area. And they called it the big blue iris. And that was in 1925 that he discovered it. And by the time he went back, collected specimens, the type specimen was collected in April of 1927. It's in the herbarium now at the New York Botanic Garden. And so this is a photo, the blue, a photo of Iris giganticerulea. And then the herbarium sheet is next to it. That's the actual herbarium sheet that is in the New York Botanic Garden. So Small did a lot of work on all sorts of plants in the southeastern US, but he discovered one of our great American irises, Iris giganticerulea. And he was what the botanists call a splitter. Everything that looked a little different, he would give it a new species. And now there are 5 recognized species of Louisiana irises. Gigantus cerulea is one of those. 3 of them had been discovered quite a number of years before. The 5th one is Iris nelsonii, and that one was not described until the 60s, and from the Abbeville Swamp in Louisiana. It's believed to be a cross of Iris fulva and Gigantus cerulea. But those 5 are what we consider currently the 5 Louisiana irises. Well, small, because he split everything out into a new species. He had close to 100 different species of Louisiana irises, but it all settled down, and now there's about 5. There are probably a couple of 1 or 2 more that might be given species status. Iris savanarum is one of those that Small described in 1925, so that's a possibility. Then 1923, here's some of the officers and judges of the American Iris Society in 1923. And a couple striking things. There are a lot of women in this photo, which in the sciences, there weren't many women in sciences. Botany was one of those sciences where there were. And so you see a lot of the women here are judges or officers. For instance, this person right in the middle, back in the middle here, is Mrs. Peckham, and she was the one who did, I think she did the 1939 checklist, which was a monumental task, just an incredible undertaking. You think about doing that without computers. This is Frank Presby in the front. And Presby Gardens is named for Frank Presby. He died before the gardens really were formed, but the late 20s, the gardens were put together, and Presby is a memorial really to Frank Presby. This is John Wister right in the middle. Fairly young man then, 1923. He died in, I think in the early 70s. So he had a long time yet to go and work on, he was also a member of something like 50 different horticultural groups. He was involved in everything. This is Robert Sturtevant, who was the first secretary of the American Iris Society, and a younger brother of Grace Sturtevant's, which we'll talk about in a minute. And this is Bertram Farr, which we've already mentioned. Bertram Farr brought in irises from all over the world and sold them through his catalog, introduced about 80 different irises himself. So let's talk about some of the irises through the first 30 years or so of the American Iris Society. And I've kind of arranged these by either type of iris or bloom sequence type thing, or by color, or just different types of irises or patterns, color patterns. So reblooming irises or remontants started early on, and we don't really think of them being around in the early 1920s, but they were. They were showing up in people's patches and fields, and a lot of hybridizers didn't even want to bother with them, and they still don't. Some hybridizers still don't. They see it as, just a lot more work. I've got all these irises in the spring, and why would I want to deal with all these rebloomers coming up? And but the Sass brothers saw them and saw the possibilities. And this one is Autumn Queen, which is an intermediate bearded iris, actually, from Hans Sass in 1926. And it was just a couple years after Autumn King. So rebloomers started early on. And then Autumn Elf, which is another registered as an IB, is 18 inches tall, a summer rebloomer from G. Percy Brown, who was a physician who graduated from Harvard Medical School, I believe, around just before or right at 1920. He worked on cold hardy rebloomers for the next few decades. And then Autumn Sunset, E. Greg Lapham, 1939. This was a tall bearded iris from two Dykes metal parents. One of those parents was Rosy Wings that got the Dykes in 1939, and Ramses that received the Dykes in 1932. So it would seem you couldn't go wrong with two Dykes metal parents, and Autumn Sunset was a rebloomer. So it was an added benefit. And then Gibson Girl. I still have Gibson Girl. I think Gibson Girl is absolutely gorgeous. It's one of those old irises that reblooms, and the note here that says it is a strong tendency to rebloom, a trait passed on to many of its descendants. And at the time, it was said to have reported rebloom in zones 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9, probably more than that now. And I mentioned Grace Sturdivant. We talk a little bit more about her. Her life was from 1865 to 1947. She was said to be, was considered the America's first lady of iris. She introduced a lot of irises from 1917 to 20. She was hybridizing before that, but her first catalog was in 1918. And then she continued working and hybridizing, introducing many irises for the next few decades. I think her last one was introduced in 1943. And her focus was color. She wanted to come out with new colors, new color patterns. And so she really worked on that. She made several color advances in irises, and she helped to found the American Iris Society. She was a charter member. She did lots of work for the AIS. And so the American Iris Society gave her the AIS Gold Medal in 1935. And she also received the Sir Michael Foster Memorial Plaque in 1938. So her work was recognized by the British Iris Society as well. She did not, for some reason, receive the AIS Hybridizers Medal. I don't know why, because she did a lot of hybridizing work, and she should have, but she didn't. But anyway, she was really, really important hybridizer and just a personality in the American Iris Society those first few decades. I think she died in 1947, and she with her brother had bought Wellesley Farm, and from where she worked, and put out her catalog, and she sold that in 1945, 2 years before she died. So going to yellow irises, and this was one of the groups that that she did work on to improve yellows. Iris flavescens from DeCandolle in 1813, very old yellow iris. For a time it was considered a species, but now usually is regarded as a natural hybrid. Some people still do call it a species, Iris flavescens. And then one of Grace Sturdivant's first yellow irises that she introduced in 1918 was Shekinah. And this was the first clear yellow of pallida growth. And this was introduced through her Glen Road Iris Garden catalog in 1918. But in 1920, this was the comment that she made, the first clear yellow of pallida growth. And that's what she was looking for, was very clear yellows. And then another one that was a little bit darker that she introduced in 1924 was Gold Imperial. And then followed quickly with Primrose in 1925. And this one is a purer tone than Shekinah, and that comment was from the Indian Spring Farms catalog in 1927. Beautiful iris. Other yellows, there was W.R. Dykes. And this one was named for William Ricketson Dykes. And it was introduced in 1926. And the Quality Gardens catalog in 1931 said that This iris is the crowning achievement of the late W.R. Dykes, and in our opinion is the most beautiful light-colored iris we have ever seen. It was hybridized and raised by Dykes, but it was named for him after his untimely tragic death in a motor vehicle accident in 1925. Dykes followed Sir Michael Foster, who died in 1913 or so, I believe. And so Dykes took up Foster's work. He wrote the seminal book on irises, the very large book on irises by Dykes that you may know of. And the Dykes Medal is, of course, named for W.R. Dykes. And that's bestowed by the British Iris Society, named for him. And that medal was begun in 1927. That's why we don't have Dykes medals for the first 6 years, 7 years, 1920 through 26, because the British Iris Society are the ones who created the Dykes medal, and they started it in 1927. And in that year, San Francisco was the first American iris to receive the American Dykes medal. And then there was a British Dykes medal given that year as well. And I think a year or so later was the first French Dykes medal in 1928 or 29. So they gave medals to various iris groups. And now there was an Australasian Dykes, but now there's an Australian Dykes and a New Zealand Dykes that are given periodically. The French Dykes lasted several years, but is no longer given. British and American Dykes still are. And then Coronation, another iris that is still around, Irving Moore, 1927. Quality Gardens said it's a strong and hardy and very profuse bloomer. Everyone who has seen it is very enthusiastic over it. And have a big clump of Coronation in our yard. It was actually given to us by Wayne and Pam Messer. And it blooms profusely and is very hardy, it's strong, and we are still very enthusiastic over it all these years later. Alta California. This is an unusual iris, a very interesting one from William Moore and Sidney Mitchell, 1931. It's the first of the big, tall yellows. Alta California is still one of the best, 48 inches tall. That was from the Carl Saalbach catalog, 1940. So the progression of the yellows, this was in 1931. Kind of an amazing iris. And then Elsa Sass, Hans Peter Sass introduced this in 1939. And Carl Saalbach, again, catalog 1941, said that it is a complete new break in yellows, coming in an entirely new shade, sometimes called lemon yellow, sometimes sulfur yellow. But it is a clear, bright yellow. And Elsa Sass was Hans Sass's wife. And so he named this iris for her. He also named a peony Elsa Sass, and that peony won the Peony Gold Medal several years later. And he named a daylily after his wife, and that daylily was named Elsa. He introduced that in 1949. So she got a lot of notoriety from his plant introductions. And then there are 3 Dykes medal winners that were yellow irises. Spun Gold was the first of the 3 of these from Howard Glutzbeck in 1939. Won the Dykes in 1944, and Carl Saalbach catalog in 1941 said it is the last word in yellows. And it possibly was then. Of course, has certainly been surpassed now, but is still a pretty magnificent yellow for that time. And then the second of the Dykes that were yellow irises was Olakala from Jacob Sass in 1943. This won the American Dykes Medal in 1948. Schreiner's Iris Lovers Catalog in 1947 said that it's rich in color, brilliant in effect. And if you've seen Olakala in person, it is one really deep, bright iris. It's an amazing iris. This was Jacob Sass's second Dykes medal. And the unfortunate thing that is that he died in 1945. So he never realized that he had won the Dykes for this, which was awarded in 1948. And then Truly Yours was the third of the three Dykes before that were introduced before 1950. This one is from Orville Faye, and we'll talk about Orville Faye in the next session next week. But this was from 1948 and 49, won the Dykes in 1953. Was very ruffled for the time and a very late blooming iris. This was actually a sensational iris when it was introduced. The buds are, as you can see, the bud at the bottom of the photo there. Buds are bright yellow because the underside of the open fall is yellow and the top side is faced with white. And so it's a kind of unusual iris. Ramsey's, which was another Dykes medal winner from the Sasses, is in Truly Yours' background. So that was the yellow irises up to that point in 1950. Then moving to white irises. White irises are sometimes natural hybrids in iris species, but there have been, over the many decades, there have been lots of work with white irises, and almost all hybridizers have put out a white iris. If you really think about it and look at it, even today, there are still hybridizers putting out these great white irises. One of the first was Taj Mahal, again, Gray Sturtevant, 1920. This is a magnificent iris. It was 38 inches tall and considered the finest white for many years, according to Ann Lowe. And you can see it is a pretty spectacular iris for 1920. And then in 1927, Purissima from Moore Mitchell was a very tall one, 48 inches tall, pure white, good form, heavy substance. Followed by Snow Flurry, Clara Rees in 1939. And I love this description from Lena Lothrop in July of 1940. She writes, "The falls in particular present a new and delightful form, for they suggest motion and look as though they just whirled into place with the edges still ruffling." So that's her description for Snow Flurry. Snow Flurry was a really important iris, and Clara B. Rees was an important person in irisdom. She was called the Queen Mother of the iris world, and she received the AIS Hybridizers Medal in 1967. She was the hybridizer of Snow Flurry in 1939, and this photo was taken nearly 30 years later, where she was shown with a placard showing the modern descendants of Snow Flurry. And all of these, you can't really read them from this picture, but every one of those is a descendant of Snow Flurry. So the importance of Snow Flurry in modern iris is monumental. And so that's a monument to both Snow Flurry and to Clara Rees. I believe there was even a Clara Rees Cup for the best white iris for several years. And then New Snow, Orville Faye, which we'll talk about the next time as well. 1946, from the Fave Gardens catalog for 1948, says that this is a white iris which is neither a warm nor a cold white, but is as white as new snow. The beard is full and bright yellow, adding a great deal of life. This is the only color in the flower, as there are no haft markings. So that was new snow, and lots of people hybridized with that. Spanish Peaks from Dr. Loomis in Colorado, introduced in 1946, a pure white self with a white beard. And this came from Purissima. Moving to Siberian irises, there were some Siberian irises, although not a lot of what we would consider many very different colors. There were some purples, blues, reddish ones, and white. And that was about it before the big change in Siberians happened in the decades after 1950. But Caesar's Brother was introduced in 1932 by F. Cleveland Morgan. And when the various sections started, most of them in the 1950s and after, when the Siberian Iris Society began and they started an award for Siberians, they called it the Morgan Award after F. Cleveland Morgan. And his own Iris, Caesar's Brother, received that award in 1953. Caesar's Brother is probably one of the most recognized Siberians there is. Hybridizers, you know, back then really looked to it as the standard, but nowadays, plants people that are gardening plants people and putting in nurseries and or plantings use Caesar's Brother a lot. It does well in the South, which a lot of Siberians have difficulty with. There were only two known 28 chromosome Siberians that all of the Siberians up to that time, the 28 chromosome Siberians, came from, and that was Iris sanguinea and Iris siberica. There are several 40 chromosome species, but those are mostly grown in the Pacific Northwest, and places like New Zealand can grow them, but they don't cross with the 28s. So most of the irises that I'll be talking about this session and the next one will be the 28 chromosomes. F. Cleveland Morgan was from Canada, and he introduced 4 Siberians, Caesar, Quebec, Caesar's Brother, and Tropic Night. And Tropic Night also went on to win the Morgan Award in 1954, a year after his introduction to Caesar's Brother. And the Morgan Award was first given in 1952. And now, after they went to medal status, it's the Morgan Wood Medal with Morgan and then Ira Wood combined to give the medal. And that's what irises that receive the highest award for Siberians beneath the Dykes can receive, is the Morgan Wood Medal each year. So Caesar's Brother, a really, really important Siberian. Another one from L. Merton Gage, which was interesting because he only introduced 2 Siberians, I think, and mostly he worked with tall beardeds, and is best known for his tall bearded rosy wings, which won the Dykes Medal in 1939. Snowcrest was one of the 2 Siberians that he introduced, and it received the AIS Hybridizers, or he received, L. Merton Gage received the AIS Hybridizers Medal in 1943. But Snowcrest was one of those white irises that's pretty close to the species, I believe. When I was growing up, you know, we had 2 Siberians that weren't named, but in thinking back about it, one was white, one was purple. It very well could have been Caesar's Brother and Snowcrest. I don't know, but they looked very much like this. But it won the Morgan Award in '63. And then the last Siberian that I'll be showing you this session is Eric the Red. And this was from Fred Whitney in 1943. So it's a a few years older than Caesar's brother and Snowcrest. But it was the first iris to win the Morgan Award in 1952. And it's a reddish pink, a beautiful old iris. I still have a lot of Eric the Red. I like it, but of course the red and pink have been far surpassed now. And then moving to pink irises, and these are pink bearded irises. This one is an interesting one, especially to comment from Cooley's catalog in 1932. This is Caroline E. Stringer from Jacob Sass in 1924. So when you think about pink irises going back to 1924, that's really a long time back. And if you look at this, you look at it and you say, well, that's white. But Cooley's catalog mentions that the Sasses gave us this lovely apple blossom pink, which I'm not sure I would agree that this is apple blossom pink, but it's a pink so pale and delicate that it is almost a tinted white. And if you look really closely, you can see that tinted white maybe down at the bottom. So this was one of the precursors of pink irises. Caroline E. Stringer. And so
Hey,
then
Gary, I just wanted to say that it's 6:30 already, believe it or not. So
okay.
you can keep going, just to speed it up maybe a little bit. So.
Okay, yeah, we started about 5 minutes late, so
Yeah.
I'll speed up a little bit. This is Truss Stringer from H.P. Sass in 1928, and it was Caroline E. Stringer crossed with Iris Trojana. And it's decidedly more pink than Caroline E. Stringer was. And then Flora Zenor, which is a lot pinker, from Jacob Sass in 1941. And this one has an unknown pollen parent because the year that they harvest the seed, they were plagued with grasshoppers when the cross was made. The grasshoppers ate the paper labels off the plants in the field, so they had no idea what the pollen parent was. And then Chantilly, I love this iris. This is from David Hall, and if you think about David Hall and the Hall pinks, he's famous for pink irises. This was 1945. Chantilly was on the cover of the 1949 Cooley's catalog. And this opens small, a clear pink, but it doubles in size and then fades to almost white. An interesting iris. And then Cherie, David Hall again, 1948, won the Dykes in 1951. And Cooley's catalog in 52 stated that this is the most famous of all the new Hall flamingo pinks, a large ruffled full-bodied pink self of excellent form and substance with a deep tangerine beard. And then Neglectas, which are blue irises, two shades of blue, a darker and lighter blue. This is Bhuto from H.P. Sass, 1926, very early. Beautiful iris. Here's a photo of Bhuto in the Sass Memorial Garden near Omaha with a whole clump of it. And then Amigo from E.B. Williamson, 1934, which was considered the yardstick by which neglectas were measured for many years. Lothario from Shriners in 1942, another beautiful iris. And then Amina's, Wabash, Mary Williamson, 1936. Probably everybody knows about Wabash, although a lot of people thought that it was E.B. Williamson that hybridized and introduced Wabash. It was actually Mary Williamson, his daughter, in 1936, and won the Dykes in 1940. There are several irises that look something a lot like Wabash. One of those is Bright Hour, but Wabash has purple-based foliage. Bright Hour does not. Also, Wabash has this sort of squarish falls, and Bright Hours are more rounded. Then Pinnacle. This one is not an American hybridizer, Jean Stevens, from 1945, but her irises were really important to the progression of Amina's. And so I added her irises, a couple of her irises in here. It says one of those significant breaks in hybridizing. That was from the Shriner's catalog. She was working for these clear aminas and clear yellows, and Pinnacle was the pinnacle of yellow aminas at the time. And then New Era from the Sass brothers was introduced as an IMB, and that's not a typo. It was for intermediate bearded, and they called it IMB at the time. But later, the registration was changed to tall bearded. It's actually a tall iris, so it should have been a tall bearded anyway. And you see the peonies there, so it's getting close to peony time. So peonies and irises go really well together. And then Summit from Gene Stevens again, 1951. This one's deeper yellow than Pinnacle, a nicer amina. And then variegatas, which are orange or pinkish and red. And this is King Tut from Hans Sass in 1926. And many years later, when he was asked what his best iris was, Hans said it was King Tut, because it was such a good iris to hybridize with. And he had an entire line called the King Tut line. So he considered King Tut to be his best iris. But then he won the Dykes with Ramsey's, and won the Dykes in 1932, but it was from the King Tut line. And this is a picture of a row of Ramsey's and the Dykes medal. If you haven't seen the Dykes medal, this is it. This was 1932, this Dykes, and so it was gold. Now the Dykes medal is silver, because in World War II they couldn't get gold. They switched to silver. So it's unusual to see a gold Dykes, but they were gold back then. And you don't see the name of the iris or the hybridizer or the date on this, but it is engraved around the edge of the medal, is where the each year when they engrave them, they engrave it on the edge with the name of the iris, the name of the hybridizer, and the year. And this is an old picture from a newspaper, actually, from of Hans and Jacob Sass. And between them, they won 4 Dykes medals, 2 hybridizer medals, a shared Foster Memorial plaque, plus they won many awards from other societies such as American Peony Society Gold Medal, American Hemeroclus Society Stout Medals. They won 2 each for both of those societies. They were just amazing American plantsmen and hybridizers. And the British Iris Society, the Sir Michael Foster Memorial Plaque is given occasionally. They don't give it every year. And several Americans have won it over the years. This is the plaque that was given to Hans Peter Sass and Jacob Sass in 1947. And again, Jacob Sass had already died, so he didn't know that he received the Foster Memorial Plaque. El Tovar was another variegata from the H.P. Sass, 1933. It's named for the iconic lodge at the Grand Canyon, El Tovar. Mm-hmm. And then I have to mention City of Lincoln. City of Lincoln is where I live, of course, and this was introduced by Hans Peter Sass, 1936. It was considered the standard for variegatas at the time, and it was a runner-up for the Dykes medal in 1939. Then the Sasses did a lot of their early work was on intermediate bearded irises. Here's a couple of them: Golden Bow in 1935 and Red Orchid 1934, one from HP, one from Jacob. And then later the Hans and Jacob Sass medal was to be given to IB irises each year as voted by AIS judges. So that was because of their important work with in getting good intermediate bearded irises.
Hey, Gary, I just wanted to mention that we're running a little late, and we started a little late because, you know, we wanted people to arrive. And so if anybody has to go, they can They can
Yeah.
just disconnect and the meeting, but don't worry about rushing, Gary. We can just go on, and anybody that needs to leave, they can just go.
Yeah,
But
it's just a few more minutes and we'll be.
no, but it's so interesting. We don't need to really rush it, and we'll have a period of questions at the end too. So if you like what you're seeing, stick around, and if not, but if you have to go, that we understand, of course.
Sure, thank you. I wanted to mention, you know, we talk about, everybody has heard a lot about John Wister, who was the first president of the American Irish Society for 14 years, and deservedly so. He was an amazing person. He really got AIS started and managed for those first 14 years. He knew amazingly exactly what to do, how to do it, and we have this great society that we have now in large part because of John Wister. But the second president of the American Irish Society was Dr. Harry Everett, H.H. Everett, Harry Harding Everett, who became president in 1935 to 1939. So he was the second longest serving president of the American Irish Society for 5 years. He was a surgeon by profession, and interesting thing, in 1940, there was the National Convention was in Evanston, Illinois, close to Chicago. And there were two pilgrimages, driving caravan pilgrimages that drove to that convention. And one of them started in Bluffton, Indiana, and the Williamsons, and went up to near Chicago to Evanston. The other one, the western route, started in Harry Everett's yard, in his garden, in Lincoln, here in Lincoln, Nebraska, and it traveled then traveled up to Omaha to the Sasses. Well, they stayed at the Cornhusker Hotel in Lincoln overnight after going to Everett's garden. They went up to the next day to the Sasses, to H.P. Sass's, and then to Jacob Sass's gardens, and then went to Council Bluffs for lunch, and I believe stayed overnight there. And then they went up to near Sioux City, Iowa, went to the Whiting Garden, and Agnes Whiting was a well-known hybridizer at that time. Later would receive the Dykes Medal in 1950, and the group in the Sioux City area, and from there they traveled east over to Freeport, Illinois, and the famous gardens of Mrs. Pattison's, and then from there to near Chicago to the National Convention in Evanston. So it was quite the pilgrimage and caravan, and some people came by train to Lincoln, and just to ride along with people on this trip to the convention. So I think we should bring that back and start doing that.
Yeah,
it sounded great.
It's fun to see the word pilgrimage there, Gary.
Yes, and that's what they called it. They called it the pilgrimage.
Huh.
Harry Everett was a surgeon, and quite well known. He was the first surgeon in this country to operate under local anesthesia, bringing with him from Vienna and Jena the first Novocaine into the United States. And he also had an interesting sense of humor, and the way he wrote, I was just reading some of his comments. Every year he would write a review, sort of a discussion of the year, and from the president's point of view. And at the end of 1935, in January of 1936, he wrote one of those reviews, and in it he addressed hybridizers who he thought were introducing too many irises from the same pod, with which differed but very little from the other. And so he said that this evil is not confined to the introductions of any one hybridizer. Can't we be just a bit more choosy? So that's one of the things that he wrote. And to judges who he thought were not voting honorable mentions, quite as many as they should have, or appropriately. He wrote a comment, says, one more surprising thing to me is in 4 or 5 of the gardens which I visited, judges were thicker than borers. It might be well if the judges realized that they had duties in addition to their inhibitions. So he was talking about the judges in that one. And then when he, in noting people who had left the AIS board that year, he mentioned John Wister, and of course all the work that Wister had done, but then and a couple of other people who had gone off the board. And then he mentioned, we shall also miss Mr. Sherman R. Duffy, and this is the way he described him, whose interest and pungent counsel always enlivened things, both in the board meetings and in the bulletin. I'm not exactly sure what that means, but it's, I may have to go back and see if I can find some.
Hey, Gary, someone here, Diana asked, is this where Perry Dyer got his annual review idea? Do you know?
I don't think so, because this was sort of a just something that the presidents at that time all did. Every year they would write a review of the year past. And maybe so. Perry's was on hybridizing, and this was much more about the AIS board and the goings on of the American Iris Society, rather than about hybridizing alone. One comment he did also make, that he noted that the attitude of the various regions, one toward another, is a very happy one. Regional jealousies are at a minimum. So he had a great sense of humor. So I've kind of just read up a lot about Harry Everett, since he and I are the only 2 AIS presidents from Lincoln, Nebraska. And then I think there are just 2 more little groups of irises here. One is Evolution of Black Irises, and this is Sable from Paul Cook, 1938, and won an award of merit in 1940. And then Black Bell, again from Gene Stevens in New Zealand, 1947. Sable was one of the parents of Black Bell. And then Sable Knight, again from Paul Cook, won the Dykes Medal in 1955. So it was one of the, if not the first blackish iris to win the Dykes Medal. And then lastly, Spuria irises. And we'll have more about these in the next session, but this is Monspur, a very, very old Spuria from Sir Michael Foster, and we've mentioned Foster before, in Great Britain, 1890. Very close to species. And then Sunny Day, 1931 from H.P. Sass. And this is one of the, if not the only Spuria that the Sass has introduced. It may be the only one. Won the Eric Nies Award in 1957 after the Spuria Iris Society was formed and they started giving awards for Spurias. And then White Heron from Carl Milliken, 1948, the Eric Nies Award in 1958. And this was the best they could get for white Spuria. And there were no white Spurias. And I'm actually, I don't know if you know, Andy, I don't know if there still are any pure white, all white Spuria.
I don't think so. I don't think so.
I don't think so either.
I actually grow this. This is a beautiful Spuria, by the way.
Yeah, it is a great iris, and it was as white as white Spurias got, although there's quite a lot of yellow in it. And that's my my take on the early years of the American Iris Society and irises.
That's fantastic. Wonderful program. We do have a couple questions.
Okay.
Let me go back here to let's see. Pat McNeil says 26 years between medals for Sunny Day.
Yeah, that was because of the Spuria Iris Society was not formed until up in the 50s. And I forgot the date was exactly, 1957 when it was given. And I think it was only the second Spurrier to receive the Eric Nies Award. So the Spurrier Iris Society was not formed until the early to mid 50s, and the first one was given, I think, in either 55 or 56. And so they reached back and pulled some of those early awards from older Spurriers just because they wanted to give them some notoriety, I think.
Here's a question from Kathy. Has the Dykes medal design remained the same from when it was first awarded?
Yes, as far as I know, the design is the same. The big difference is it went from gold to silver.
And it was designed by the British Iris Society?
British Iris Society. There is a little bit of a difference now. It's actually not as much silver now. I think the last year that I was president of AIS, the British Iris Society decided because they paid for these Dykes medals all of these years. The American Iris Society would tell them which iris won and who the hybridizer was, the year, and all that sort of thing. The British Iris Society paid for everything else. They had the medal. They had the medals there. They had them engraved. They would ship them to the American Iris Society. They would be given to the winner, the hybridizers that won for those irises. And they did that for like 90 years, where they paid for it. And it got to be just a few years ago, the expense was becoming for silver, and they were, I'm not exactly sure exactly what the percentage of silver was, but it was a pretty high percentage of silver. And it was too costly for them to continue to do a Dykes for themselves, for the Americans, for New Zealand and Australia. And so what they asked for was that we pay for the Dykes medal, and that we had a choice then of having them continue as they were or plated. And I think everyone has chosen plated. The cost was just prohibitive for the real silver.
Here's a question from Scarlett Ayers. Is it true that early hybridizers tried to get rid of haft markings?
Yes, haft markings were considered a big no-no. You know, they really tried to get rid of them. And you know, they were hybridizing all sorts of things, you know, trying to remove those haft markings. And now you see hybridizers really looking to cash in on those haft markings and accentuate them and pull them all the way down to the edges of the petals, all sorts of things. So things change. You know, viewpoints and likes and dislikes change.
Someone asked, let's see, Debbie asked if we're recording this, and yes, the answer to your question is yes, we're recording all of these presentations, and they will be available at a later date. We have to upload into somewhere. We're not sure yet, but they will be available. Okay, I think that's about all. I'm trying to see if there's any more questions. Nope, I think that's all the questions I have. Anyways, people are, I wanted to tell you that we are coming back next week. The invitation to attend next week's presentation will be sent to you all on Friday. So be on the lookout for news and notes, and be sure that we do have your email, your current email. That way we can make sure that it gets to you. Okay, Gary, thank you so much. It was a wonderful presentation, and we'll see you next week.
Okay.
And goodbye, everybody. Good to see you.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
See you next time.